on behalf of Ziv, who's overseas, I'd like to introduce Scott Kelly, Dr. Scott Kelly. He's a research principal at the Institute of Sustainable Futures at UTS, and his main research interests include the economics of energy demand, energy systems modelling, and the economics of climate change. He's also a project director in sustainability, finance and economics, and a panel member of the Sustainability Advantage program. He's a research affiliate of the Electricity Policy Research Group and an associate of the Centre for Climate Change Mitigation Research at the University of Cambridge. Prior to his role at ISF, he was a senior research associate at the University of Cambridge in UK and a junior research fellow at Darwin College. In 2012, he got his PhD from the University of Cambridge in the field of economics, energy and climate change. Also in 2007, he was awarded the Rotary Ambassadorial Award to do a Master's Philosophy in Sustainable Development. Other awards include the C.T. Taylor Scholarship, Cambridge Trust Scholarship, and the Cambridge Econometrics Bursary. He also holds a Master's of Renewable Energy and a Bachelor of Mechanical Engineering with honours from the University of Auckland. He is the author of several book chapters, has published papers in a range of energy journals on the topic of energy systems modelling, energy policy and climate change. In other words, he's pretty amazing. Thanks, Scott.
I think I need to shorten my blurb a little bit in the future. No, it's a real pleasure to be here. I've heard a lot about this research group and the research that goes on here at UNSW, so it's good to finally be down here to meet some of you. As Sharon indicated, I moved over here from the UK and I've been a researcher at the Institute for Sustainable Futures since the start of the year. And one of the first projects, or the first project that I was given, was this one, which is looking at the economics of the local generation network credits and trying to get a handle on what the costs and benefits of implementing this scheme might mean for the Australian energy system. And so that's going to be the main presentation that I'll give today. My presentation is split into two parts. The first part I'll go over the research project overall, and then the second part of my research presentation will look at the economic modelling part of that project, which was crucial in the AEMC rule determination process. I've kind of will go into a bit of the rule determination process, but if there are questions at the end, I'm happy to go into more detail on what happened during that process. So part one. This research project was a $400,000 research project primarily funded through ARENA, and we pulled together a range of industry partners to work with us on this project. It started in August of 2014 and then ended last month. So it was a 2-year project, and I have only been involved in this project for the last 6 months doing the economic modelling component of that. Essentially, the research project consisted of these steps. There are a number of virtual trials, so these are on-the-ground trials looking at different schemes for how the LGNC might work. CHP systems, council buildings, using various distributed technologies, and then looking at the costs and benefits of what this might mean and how these systems might become more economic if an LGNC payment were made. And then this is the economic modelling and benefits of the impact is the bit that I worked on. And then the final step is increasing stakeholder engagement. And so we've just been on a process of going around Australia, speaking with various retailers and network businesses about the potential opportunity for local generation network credits, but also local energy trading, which is the other component of this research project. The economic modelling is focused just on the local generation network credits. So what is it exactly that we're trying to do with implementing the local generation network credits? So on the left-hand side, you'll see that the typical generation system where you have large centralised power stations, feeding residential and commercial consumers at the end of the spectrum. And as we all know, the system is evolving, becoming increasingly decentralised. And as we go through this process, you'll notice that a lot of this infrastructure isn't required anymore. So transporting electricity across large distances, so we're saving essentially future capital expenditure through large infrastructure by investing in distributed generation further down in the system. And so my job really was to understand and calculate what the economic costs and benefits of introducing these distributed generation technologies might mean for upstream and local transmission and distribution network capital infrastructure. As we know, the electricity system is evolving very rapidly. There are many things that are yet to happen, and we don't exactly know how this is going to play out and how long it's going to take. However, there are some significant things happening in electric vehicles, disruptive business models, and battery technologies within the home. So if we look at the network charges as they are now, typically a consumer pays for the network costs, the infrastructure across the entire network infrastructure system. And so what we're arguing is that if a consumer only consumes the electricity that was distributed in their part of the system, why should they have to pay for the full costs of that system? And so when this proposal originally was proposed, the idea was that it was a partial charge would be given to those consumers on those parts of the network, but implementing that in practice is actually very difficult. And so instead of decreasing the charges to consumers, instead we wanted to give the credit to the generators on that system to recognise the fact that that energy is being consumed locally and not exported across other parts of the grid. The other thing to note is the breakdown of charges across the network. Obviously these change depending on where you are and where you're located and the costs of the system. So this is just a kind of ballpark analysis of where the costs lie. But you can see there are still significant costs to be saved throughout the entire system through avoided network augmentation. And this is all in the background and the backdrop of what's been happening in Australia over the last 10 years. Since 2007, we've seen electricity prices almost double. And if we look at the breakdown of where these cost increases have come from, 60% of that increase has come from expanding the network because forecasts were made about future demand. And as we all know, that demand hasn't materialised. So we're living in a system where we have a lot of spare capacity. Now this varies from state to state, and this also needs to be considered when doing the modelling, is how much spare capacity is actually available across different states and different networks. And I'm sure that you're all familiar with the concept of load defection and grid defection. Grid defection being when a consumer completely disconnects themselves from the grid and relies on their own generation from PV. Usually would probably require a battery as well in order to supply or have that energy available when they require it. And load defection is already happening when you have generation behind the meter and is being consumed behind the meter, therefore not requiring imports from the grid. And this leads to the so-called death spiral, where you have the fixed costs of infrastructure needing to be recovered from a smaller base of consumers on the network. And so this LGNC payment was proposed to avoid this situation occurring further, to utilise the existing infrastructure as efficiently as possible. Another recent phenomenon that's been happening is the fact that even though we might see increasing aggregate demand on the network, if we look at, if we take away rooftop PV, the effects of energy efficiency, price change effects, small DG, then actually we're seeing flat or declining growth in some states, and the latest AMO projections actually indicate declining peak demand on networks. And so this is changing how networks are viewing and investing in network infrastructure. So the question is, have we actually now reached peak grid? Will this continue on into the future? Or will other technologies come on board, like electric vehicles, change this dynamic and actually mean that the demand from the network might change again? In the context of all of these reasons, the LGNC rule change was proposed to fill some of the gaps in the existing regulatory framework, to recognise the benefits that distributed generators provide to the network in terms of avoided augmentation and network support. So some of the benefits of this include reduced load defection, maintain network utilisation. It will potentially unlock local energy projects that were otherwise uneconomic to complete, and unlock new product offerings, for example, local electricity trading, which is the other component of this project, where you have potentially a company that owns two buildings on the opposite sides of a suburb, where one is producing excess electricity and they can then net that off on their premises at another part of the network via using the distribution network and paying for the use of that network. So at the moment that doesn't necessarily occur. So this was the rule change proposal that was put forward by the City of Sydney, the Total Environment Centre and the Property Council of Australia. It was put forward to the AEMC last year, in July 2015, and the AEMC have been working through that with the proponents since then. However, you may have heard that recently on the 22nd of November, the AEMC decided not to implement the recommendations of this proposal, and they actually decided to consider only a very narrow definition of what was in this proposal, even though out of the back of the economic modelling that we were doing, we were recommending something very different to what they had interpreted, and suggesting that they make changes to this rule change to make it more economic. And unfortunately they didn't do that, and decided to come up with an unrelated proposal to fix the congestion in lower parts of the network. And I'm happy to, at the end of this presentation, to go into more detail on what was wrong with and how they interpreted this rule change process. But I think for the purposes of this presentation, I'd like to walk you through the economic modelling that we did to try and estimate what the network value of distributed generation is for electricity markets. So my questions that I wanted to answer were, at a macro level, what are the costs and benefits of introducing a local generation network credit over the long term? And then at a consumer level, how do consumers benefit from this change, and what consumers benefit and what consumers don't benefit as much? And in order to answer this question, I needed to consider, firstly, how might peak demand on the network change over time, and what consumers and producers and prosumers on the network lead to that change in peak demand growth. How might imports and exports from those consumers change, and what are the overall economic costs and benefits occurring from avoided network augmentation in the future. So there are several tenets that I based this on, and these are well-known economic principles, typically widely cited, and they've been relevant for a very long time. Firstly, we have allocative efficiency, and that is making sure that resources are allocated to the most productive uses in the network. So that signals making sure that there's cost reflectivity in how investments are made, to send signals to different consumers on the network where investments, to signal to investors where different investments need to occur. We have productive efficiency that requires the production of goods and services at the lowest possible cost. And then, of course, we have dynamic efficiency, so making sure that investments are made both allocatively and productively across time as well. And so this has been very important in this modelling because it's the time element that is crucial to when investment is required on the network and how that investment might be avoided. And then finally, there needs to be a certain level of cost recovery of that network infrastructure to make sure that the networks can recover what they've spent in building that network infrastructure. So in essence, prices must be set to encourage optimal use of existing infrastructure while simultaneously signalling the cost of additional unit of capacity to the system. And what's come out of this and is fairly well accepted is that setting electricity prices to the marginal costs will promote the most efficient and use and production of goods and services on the network. And so this is really where the economic modelling was based. We used the long run marginal cost of network expansion, which was provided by each of the different networks to estimate what the costs of that expanding peak demand might be under different scenarios. So before I go into the details of the model, there's a bit of terminology that I need to go through. So the model is a representative agent model. The representative agent is simply a consumer, a producer, or a prosumer on the network. They represent the average characteristics of all agents within that particular category. And therefore, if you increase the number of agents belonging to that category over time, you can estimate how much either export or import or own consumption that agent has on the network. Different agents belong to different customer classes. So there are 3 representative agents, for example, in the residential category. There are 3 representative agents in the commercial category, and agents can switch between categories over time. And so because the profiles of these different agents varies between each representative agent, as agents switch categories, that has an overall impact on the peak demand of the grid over time. Network expansion is simply the investment in additional infrastructure and includes augmentation expenditure, operational expenditure, and replacement expenditure. Replacement expenditure is a little bit of a tricky one, and I can go into more detail about how we dealt with that. Gross generation is simply the total amount of generation on the network. Gross consumption is the total consumption on the network for each representative agent. Net exports is own generation minus what you don't. So if your generation is greater than what your own consumption requirements are, there's net exports to the grid, and then net imports are the reverse of that. So it's a simple rule in the agent-based model to determine at what points in time over the day, based on the profile, exports and imports were being made. In order to construct this model, a range of data sets were used across, and you're probably familiar with a lot of these. These are the representative agents. So as you can see, different agents have different characteristics. A typical residential consumer only draws electricity from the network. A residential and solar consumer can consume their own electricity but also export to the grid. A residential plus solar plus battery. At the moment, the model is calibrated so that the residential consumer only consumes their own energy, but they don't export to the grid. But that can be changed in the model, and indeed the profile and discharge strategies can be changed based on the economic incentives for them to do that. So someone with a battery might choose to export that electricity to the grid, and that does have a substantial impact in how the grid performs and the change in overall peak demand. We also look at commercial customers. They have similar characteristics, and we look at large industrial. The large industrial customer class includes large commercial with cogeneration plants and large commercial cogeneration plants, plus what would happen if there was an LGNC payment. So those cogeneration plants would be larger, and they would have the potential to export to the grid more electricity. And then finally, we have 3 distributed energy types. We have wind power, solar farms, and standalone non-scheduled generation. So this includes everything, combined heat and power or diesel generators or anything that's connected at the distribution level that can just be exported. So there's no behind the meter consumption allowed with that one. And then any demand within that distribution network that's not met by generation in that area is the residual, and that's met by the centralised power generation coming in externally. The model is set up in different levels. So we have residential and commercial consumers connected at the low voltage level. When those needs aren't met by when generation and consumption exceeds generation on that level, imports are required from the higher level of the network. And then, so it's a cascading effect until you get to the centralised plant, which produces electricity to feed everything else. So if you have more distributed generation further down in the network, then you're not requiring to import electricity at times higher up on the network. So it's a cascade type system. This is probably a bit confusing, but just to show that there's different, it's because this model is essentially a very complicated Excel model in this version of it. This essentially shows the different sheets that are used to calculate and the steps required. So we have the representative agents coming in as their profiles. We then have the gross generation predictions being done in one sheet. We then have gross consumption profiles being created. Then we can, with those profiles, we can then create the net consumption and generation, flowing through to estimating what the peak demand for each of the users will be, and then the coincident peak demand on the network across all the users. We can estimate the annual load on the network. We can then go through and estimate, based on how the peak demand grows over time, what the augmentation costs under that scenario might be, and then finally how that flows through to consumer bills, and then finally we do a bunch of sensitivity tests looking at what happens if peak demand changes or you have different number of users on the network. So just to give you an idea of what the profiles look like, there are 4 profiles used to estimate electricity consumption across the year, 3 for each of the seasons, where autumn and spring are included as one season, and then we have a peak day profile as well. These profiles were taken from CSIRO data, and an optimization was used so that this profile exactly matches what the aggregate consumption of all representative agents in that particular category mean. So this is the perfect average of, so if you sum, for example, if you summed all of the residential consumers on the network up together, then you would get a profile that looked like this. For representing an average. So if you sum the area under the curve, this represents the annual consumption, and if you sum the peak day and the peak across all the agents, you get the peak consumption. Yeah? And then we augment that with the PV load, and then you can create a new profile which approximates what the net import and net export requirements are for that representative agent, where below 0 represents exports to the grid and above 0 represents import from the grid at that particular time. So all the agents have got these profiles embedded within them. So now what are the limitations of this model? So firstly, it considers quite long time horizons, so we're going out to 2050. This, in a rapidly changing energy market, this is quite a limitation because we know that the energy system is going to change substantially. However, network investments do have very long lifetimes, and so we need to take a long consideration in doing this type of modelling, but recognise that through discount rates. Secondly, it's a deterministic model, so we don't for example, draw agents from a stochastic distribution of different consumption. So we're only looking at the average consumer within each representative agent category, and then multiplying that number by the total number of agents in that category to get the total. A more accurate way of doing that would be to do a stochastic type model. And in this version, we're only also looking at 2 exogenous scenarios. So we're looking at business as usual, expansion on the network, and then what would happen if we had an LGNC payment being made. We also, as I said, we approximate each customer category as the average. We don't include the costs of upgrading the network to handle increased distributed generation. So we understand that this is a cost, and this can come off the final cost that we calculate at the end. But also we don't include savings of a reduction in replacement expenditure. So in a system of flat or declining peak demand, the argument can be made that you can replace the capacity of the system with smaller systems as they become old and need to be replaced, and therefore save money through downsizing. But we haven't assumed that in this model, any savings from REPEX. And at the moment, we're only modelling data for New South Wales. So the final scenario that we came to, based on a number of different iterations and looking at the economic costs, was firstly the customer numbers, capacity and generation of New South Wales. We also make the assumption that LGNC payments are not made to existing generators. When we started this model, we did pay it to everyone, but the results indicated that this wasn't economically beneficial for society, so we excluded existing generators. We also recommend not making payments to systems under 10 kilowatts. So this excludes most residential PV systems, and we made this decision firstly for economic reasons. There was a huge cost to making these payments because the majority of distributed generation is from these smaller systems, but also the incremental benefit offered by the LGNC wasn't seen as significant to change the behaviour and invest in further PV on the system. And the original rule change proposal was actually made and proposed for the larger type systems where the gap exists at present. We also know that there's significant capacity on the existing infrastructure network, and so what we assume that no investment is required until 2025, and this equates to a capacity of around 600 megawatts in New South Wales. We also take a benefit share, so of the augmentation savings that are potentially available, we only make a payment of 80% of that value back as LGNC payments to consumers, whereas the 20% is a welfare benefit for everyone. We model growth projections based on AMO projections. LRMC values were modelled independently from some research commissioned by Energia, and they include four different networks, but we used details for Ausgrid and Essential Energy. And we also assume that costs of augmentation are allocated to customers based on a volumetric basis of how much electricity they're consuming from the grid. If you did completely cost reflectivity and allocated costs based on their peak demand requirements, then you also get a very different solution. So we made this assumption because this is essentially how costs are passed on at present, but as we move to more cost reflectivity, this would have significant impacts in the model. So initial conditions, this is just a quick table showing you what the average values represent. So on the left-hand side, we see the number of agents in each category. We see the gross consumption, and then we see the net consumption. So this is how much electricity is required to come in from the grid. We also estimate gross consumption per agent, gross generation per agent, and then how much of that generation is actually exported to the grid. So how much of that generation exceeds their consumption requirements. And then you can get a sense for what the aggregate consumption across the entire network is, across the two scenarios. And again, for aggregate generation. And so now I'll move on to what the results are telling us. So under this scenario, we see on the left in the business as usual case, an increase in distributed generation to 12.7 terawatt hours per year across the different representative agent categories. And then in the LGNC scenario, this is increases to 20.4. So this is an exogenous assumption of the model. And so what we wanted to do was what are the economic costs and benefits of this scenario occurring. And then we can look at consumption. So on the left-hand chart, we see gross consumption. So in 2015, we have gross consumption of around 67 terawatt hours. And by 2050, this is increasing to around 94 terawatt hours. Now, of course, gross consumption stays the same in both scenarios because the total consumption is the same. It's just whether that consumption is coming from behind the meter or somewhere lower down within the distribution network. So this is really what the next graph shows, the net import consumption. So as in the LGNC scenario, you have more agents consuming behind the meter and you have a higher uptake of distributed generation on the lower levels, then you get a lower level of import consumption coming from the grid, represented by the 79 terawatt hours there on the right-hand chart. Now approximating what will happen to growth in peak demand, we see peak demand going from approximately 11.3 gigawatts in 2015 to 13.9 in 2050. And then in the LGNC scenario, this peak demand is nearly not as significant across the entire network and goes to 12.5 gigawatts. And then if you break this down by where those savings are actually made at different levels on the network, 35% of the savings are at the low voltage network. 54% of the savings come at the high voltage network, and then 63% of the savings come at the transmission level of the network. So you're getting the aggregate effect of the savings from lower parts of the network accumulating up to the transmission level. So what happens to a typical, this is the profile of the network by summing the profiles of all the different agents together and then looking at what the coincident peak demand will do. And so business as usual is on the left, and then this is what would happen in the LGNC scenario on the right. And so now we've got an understanding of what's going to happen to peak demand. We can then estimate what the total costs of that will be based on the long run marginal costs of an increase in per marginal unit of megawatt capacity on the grid. And essentially what we see is in 2020, because LGNC payments are being made to distributed generators, but there's not necessarily any savings in decreased augmentation of the grid. So we're not seeing any reduction in capital expenditure. We're seeing a cost of 6 million. But as we move into the future and the grid, we're seeing savings in augmentation. These quickly outstrip the payments being made by local generation network credits. And by 2030, we're seeing savings of 100 million. And then by 2050, a net present value of around 1.2 billion. So not small numbers by any state of the imagination, but keep in mind that this is a very long time frame as well. And if we look at the incremental costs, so how these costs accumulate over time, we see that that the difference in the bars is the benefit. And one of the key questions we were asking early on was why is there such a huge benefit of the LGNC payment when you'd think that when you're talking about this 80-20 benefit share, it should, if you just think it deterministically through, that it should just be 80%. And the reason that we're getting such a saving is because you're only making payments for exported electricity to the grid. But what that's doing is it's incentivizing people to install more PV or more behind the meter generation. And because consumption is occurring behind the meter, this is actually avoiding more peak demand on the network. So you're getting a multiplier effect by incentivizing through exports, but you're making more savings through reduced peak demand from behind the meter consumption. And that's where that additional benefit is coming from. So breaking this down into table form under the BAU scenario, total network costs of around 2 billion to 2050. And then in the LGNC scenario, we see network investment significantly reduced to around 600 million. And then LGNC payments equating to around 230 million. So if you sum those up, your total costs are around 830 million. And so the difference between these two scenarios is around 1.2 billion in savings. So what does this look like for consumer bills? And again, I said at the start that these are allocated based on a volumetric basis, so how much those consumers are importing from the grid. And also we're just talking about savings to the network component of the bill. And we know that that component for Australia is quite significant, 50%. So for the residential case, in 2050, if we compare, so this is differences with business as usual. And so by 2050, we're seeing a reduction in the bill for a residential consumer of $20, and then for a residential with PV of $13, and then a residential PV with battery of $4. If we go to the commercial customers, so because in this model we're excluding payments to PV, it's not a significant effect. But if we go to the small commercial consumers, where these users do get an LGNC payment, we see the small commercial consumers getting a reduction of $422, and the small commercial with PV, including exports, of $350. So the question is, why is it that a small commercial that doesn't have PV is getting a higher reduction in their bill than someone who is receiving the payment? And the answer is simply because that user is interacting with the grid, and because the savings that they're receiving through that through what they would normally pay for electricity, they're receiving all the benefits of that. Whereas a small commercial with PV, they're interacting with the grid a lot less, so they're not receiving any of those augmentation savings. Because they've got lower import requirements from the grid. So what this suggests is that those people who interact with the grid more are actually receiving more of the benefit than those who don't interact with the grid. We also looked at network utilisation, again an important parameter for networks. And for the transmission and high voltage networks, we see an increase in network utilisation. Because of the flattening of the profile. And then we also looked at additional savings from avoided augmentation. So if you're transporting electricity from a centralised plant all the way to a consumer, there are losses along that system. And so if you don't need to transport that electricity from those losses, then you also don't need to augment the electricity and invest in new systems to account for those losses. And so this isn't as significant as the other, but it's still a saving nonetheless, and we approximate that by 2050 that's around 28 million in augmentation savings from system losses. So I understand I've only got 10 minutes left, but I've got probably 4 slides on sensitivity testing, but it would be great to have some questions at some point as well. So I'll try and go a bit quicker through the sensitivity testing. So this is why we made the decision not to pay the LGNC to small systems. Firstly, roughly 60% of the payments were going to residential customers in the scenario where we made the payments, and then when we took out those payments to small systems, it was distributed generation of small commercial customers, which was the intention of the rule change process. It also meant that our economic analysis, when we included small systems, the economic cost in 2030 was negative 9 million, so it was a cost to the system, whereas when we excluded them, this increased to 104 million, so it turned into a benefit. We wanted to understand the effects of changing peak demand over time, so we did some sensitivity analysis to change the annual incremental growth rate. So we looked at that from 1.1% down to almost 0%, whereas 0.6% per year was the modelled case. And what we see is this very asymmetric shape where the higher growth you have in peak demand, the much larger the economic savings or the benefits you get from that. And then if you've got flat or declining peak demand, you're getting this negative cost occurring. Now, the way that this will be implemented in practice is very different to how we've modelled it. So we assume that long-run marginal costs are fixed in this model over the long term. And therefore the LGNC payments, which are based on the long-run marginal costs, are also fixed, and therefore you're getting this type of shape. But in reality, how we foresaw the LGNC payments being made was that as future peak demand change, this would change long-run marginal costs, or the costs of augmentation. So if your costs of expanding the network tend towards zero, then your LGNC payments would also tend towards zero because you're not making any potential savings, and therefore, in the case of reality, you would actually get no negative costs because your long-run marginal cost would be zero, and therefore your local generation network credits would also be zero. We looked at what would happen if the year of augmentation was pushed back. So like I said before, we assumed that no augmentation was required until 2025. This is just some sensitivity showing what would happen. So if we don't require augmentation until 2027 or 2028, then you also get this LGNC being a negative cost to society because there's so much spare capacity in the network, you don't actually need to make the payments. We looked at the year the augmentation was first required. We looked at the rate of growth of local generation and uptake. And in general, the more local generation you have on the network, the more the economic benefit. We also looked at the estimates of long-run marginal costing for transmission rather than TUOS charging, and this again had no significant effect on the overall result. Some of the opponents to the LGNC rule change were suggesting that this was just another form of cross-subsidy, and so we looked at this in detail, and our argument is that it's actually not a cross-subsidy because avoiding future augmentation costs are a benefit to all consumers on the network, and it's not necessarily one consumer making a payment to another consumer on the network. So, just in conclusion, we see that the LGNC scenario has network costs that are 60% below the business as usual scenario, given the assumptions that we've modelled. We see that all customer categories receive reductions in their bills between 2025 and 2030, and our conclusions were also robust to a range of different sensitivity tests. And from this modelling, we're able to make recommendations to AEMC that firstly don't include existing systems in the LGNC payments and don't pay systems under 10 kilowatts. They ignored both of these recommendations and then commissioned some work from AECOM to only look at PV systems, include existing systems in the analysis. And of course, and we told them that this wasn't going to be economic, but that was the finding that they came out with anyway, and that was what they based their decision on, even though we were recommending against it, which was an interesting final outcome for the rule change process. So what is the future research for this modelling? Firstly, we'd like to expand this model to look at different states in Australia. We'd also like to incorporate some dynamic feedback in the model. So what happens as you increase DG? Well, how does that impact LGNC payments? And then how does that again impact DG uptake? We'd like to model the effects of electric vehicles and batteries and different discharge strategies, because this obviously has an important effect on peak demand. We'd also like to include the effects of REPEX, replacement expenditure, and then finally do some probabilistic models, so change the distributions. At the moment we're just looking at average representative agents, but of course there's a range of different representative agents, and you can represent those through a stochastic distribution and make your model more realistic by drawing those agents from a stochastic distribution. So that's it. I'd really be pleased to have some questions and extend this further, and we can talk about anything that you want. Thanks. Hi.
Yeah, hi, thanks for that. When you have the savings for different consumers and businesses, you have the dollar amounts. But I would imagine the commercial would have larger bills in general.
Yeah.
Were the percentages all kind of roughly the same, or were the percentages, do you know what I mean, like the percentage savings on each bill?
Yeah, no, so this is something I've had feedback as well. I think it would probably, when I write the paper to go along with this, I'll use savings per kilowatt hour, or percentage of the bill. We use this dollar amount because it was more real for policymakers, but I do take that feedback. And yeah, there's a number of ways you can either look at the percentage of the total bill, so including own generation, or just the percentage of imports. But yeah, so this value did include those commercial agents and industrial agents. Obviously, have the average consumption of those is much larger than a resident, so that's why the savings are so much higher. Yeah.
And a follow-on question. So, the kind of economic benefit that, if you like, the society is getting, is that mainly captured in those reduced bills, or is there also some component that, say, the government ends up saving?
So all of the savings from augmentation flow through to customer bills. Yeah. So all of the savings flow through a volumetric payment. Yeah. Except for the 20%. So that 20% is a saving that's just avoided costs, and then 80% of that avoided cost flows through to the savings in consumer bills.
Would be the whoever has to not install. So it's
whoever has to not install.
So it's not necessarily the government itself.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So we started to discuss a little bit the LRMC, the long run marginal cost. I've heard that sort of how long run marginal cost is calculated can be variable between different network companies. How significant would the variance in cost be in terms of the benefit?
No, yeah. So long run marginal cost does vary by network, and it varies because different networks have different. They're responsible for different parts. So some networks are responsible for a lot of rural and not much cities, and some networks are responsible for a lot of cities and substations, and so it depends on what's in their network and what their ultimate LRMC is. In our modelling, when we looked at Ausgrid and Essential, the differences weren't significant, but what is different is how peak demand is, how the different networks allocate peak demand. So and that depends on where the peak demand is in their network is, and that obviously has a follow-through effect on this model because LGNC payments are made based on what the operator, where the operator sets its peak demand period being in, and those LGNC payments are calculated to pay out during that period. So that is a significant difference, is when the peak period for the different networks is. But the LRMC is different, but not significantly so that it makes a big impact. Yeah.
If the value of the LRMC changed much, would that have an impact on the total savings?
Yes. It does. Yeah, so because the long run marginal cost is what is used in the calculation of what the future costs are going to be, if your net present value of megawatt hour investment, dollars per megawatt hour investment, changes, and that changes what your total investment is going to be. Yeah, and so in a scenario of flat and declining peak demand, you could make the argument that LRMC should tend towards zero. But then you could also make the argument that there are other costs within LRMC that aren't associated with just a growth in peak demand. They're also associated with upgrading the network to account for increased smart technology to allow bidirectional flows of distributed generation. And so there is some argument that could be had that there's a component of LRMC that won't go towards zero, but definitely just expanding the network to include larger capacities. If that goes to zero, then that component, the future cost should go to zero from that. Yeah.
Do we have one last question? Because I think we're getting close to the end of time.
Just a little more on the LRMCs. You said you used Energia estimates.
Yeah, that's right.
Did they come fairly close to what the networks themselves say are their LRMCs as part of the...
Yeah, so they actually use the network's LRMCs to calculate So they really expanded what the networks were saying. So we wanted some more detail around
Oh, so you LRMC at each voltage level?
at each voltage level and for different types of connections, so rural and city and different networks, so high voltage transmission. So we had LRMCs for all the different levels of the network. Yeah.
I mean, we see why you use them. I must say they do make me nervous because of the many varied ways they can be calculated. Just one more thought. I wonder if your modelling undersells things a bit. I mean, you had peak demand in New South Wales hitting 13.5 gigawatts in, I don't know, was it 10 years or something? It hit that some years back. And if we do get the sense of extreme weather and perhaps new electrical loads coming on, be it EVs or people leaving gas, I think it's going to really change the value of this because you're just going to see greater peak demand, hence much more opportunity to try and do something about it.
So you see peak demand increasing? Yeah, right.
Extreme weather, but also people are going to, certainly residential is going to start leaving gas, I think, and then EV uptakes the wild card there. So I think, I do wonder if your work's underselling the potential value because of, I think picking up on the point here about the numbers, you know, $7 in 2050.
Yeah.
Right, okay, what's the actual bill in 2050?
Yeah,
and then I'll get a sense of what $7 means, but you know.
Oh, sorry, this was all in today's dollars.
Yeah. But there's
What's the
probably
total
a growth sitting in there, right? How many percent?
Oh yeah, but because we're comparing two scenarios, you assume that the underlying growth in both scenarios.
But I still need to know what those numbers are to know what the
Yeah,
percentage
yeah,
significance of it is, which I think was the point made there.
That's a good point. Yeah.
Alright.
Okay.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. I do know that there are some people waiting to come into the room. So thank you again, Scott Kelly.
Thank you.
For